Okay, another sort of interesting thing that reminds me, there's some sort of odd coincidences here about this. 2 years before the assassination, when I was still a resident at Parkland Hospital, my wife was working part-time as a nurse at Baylor Hospital, helping take care of Mr. Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, who had been admitted here for treatment. As you know, he's a Texan from Bonham. And she was helping take care of him. And she called me one day and said, I forgot to pick up my check at Baylor today. Would you go by on your way home and pick up my check? I said, sure, be glad to do that. And so I never went to Baylor before. I mean, not ordinarily. I've been to Baylor, here and there and yonder a time or two, but not ordinarily. But that day, I drove over, middle of the late part of the afternoon, and parked across the street from Baylor, got out of my car, was walking across Gaston Avenue, and I looked over to my left and saw 3 motorcycle cops leading 3 long black limousines down Gaston Avenue toward a side street that was then there in a much smaller Baylor hospital that went up to a side entrance at Baylor. Well, that little motorcade with the police motorcyclist pulled up to that side door of Baylor about the same time I got there. And in fact, I was standing at the curb by the rear door of the lead limousine when one of the policemen came back and politely asked me to step back out of the way so he could open the lead door of the limousine. And he did so, and who should step out but President Kennedy. I could have leaned across and patted him on the back as he went by, and he quickly strolled on into the side entrance and went up to see Mr. Sam Rayburn. He had flown down here especially on that day to see Mr. Rayburn. Of course, Mr. Rayburn was the political power at that time in Washington, so he had made the effort to come down and visit him. And I thought later, many times, what are the odds that I would have been there standing so close to him that I could have touched him at that time. And, it's kind of just an odd coincidence that I thought I'd mention to you. Okay, so what else am I forgetting? I think that's...
Does anybody have any questions of the doctor?
Yes, sir.
Sir, in 2000, I had a spinal laminectomy in Houston at Methodist Hospital, and the neurosurgeon that performed the surgery was Dr. Robert Grossman.
Yes.
Do you remember him?
Yes,
He was
yes,
there that
yeah,
day.
he
I
was
didn't
there.
realize that.
Yes, he was there. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he was there in the room. He didn't perform any
was an
surgery on
intern,
him, but
I
he
think,
was there. Yeah, he and Dr. Clark, his chief, the one that was standing by the ECG, they were both there together. Yes, sir.
Were you or any of the other surgeons called before the Warren Commission to give testimony?
Well, all of us were called. In fact, that's another kind of an interesting coincidence. The person who described the so-called magic bullet, in other words, they said that the bullet that injured Kennedy also injured Connally, whom I also helped operate on Connally later that afternoon, explored his leg wound. Anyway, that person who described the magic bullet was Senator Specter, Arlen Specter. He was a young 32-year-old lawyer at that time, and he's the one, Senator Specter is the one who interviewed me for the Warren Commission at Parkland Hospital. Another kind of odd coincidence. And of course, as you all know, he just died. So another odd coincidence. So, someone?
Right here.
Was your testimony before the Warren Commission accurately reproduced in the report?
Yes, it was. Now, I didn't go, at that time, I didn't know, all the things that I just said here. But I just told them what I had seen there. And of course, at the time, what I had seen there didn't entail any knowledge about what went on in Dealey Plaza or anything else. But it was accurate, yeah. Yes.
Did you get to speak with Mrs. Kennedy about the procedure?
Never said a word to her, nor she to me. I just saw her those times, but no communication with her. Yes, ma'am.
entry wound or exit wound, the one that you went in the neck?
Well, I think that was an exit wound, the one from the neck, that the bullet that hit him in the back that caused him to put his hands up to his neck that we could see on the Zapruder film. Oh, mentioning Mr. Zapruder reminds me of one other odd coincidence that I'll mention because it is very strange. Probably 7 or 8 years after the assassination, I was sitting in my office one day and I got a phone call from a surgeon friend of mine at Presbyterian Hospital. And he said, I'm calling you to see if I could get you to help me this afternoon. He said, are you going to be over at Presbyterian? And I said, yeah, I've got some patients there. I need to come by and see them. And he said, well, I operated on a man today and did a gastric resection on him for a gastric cancer. And he's not doing so well, and I think maybe he needs to be re-explored. And I wondered if when you came over, if you would scrub with me. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. So I got in my car and drove over to Presbyterian, went into the operating room, asked the nurse there at the nursing station, I said, what room are we operating in? And she said, well, I forgot, look back on the board, and you'll see your name and the patient's name and the room on the scheduling board, because they had just put it up, but she didn't know who had done that. So I stepped around to the scheduling board and looked up and saw our names, the surgeons, myself, and the other surgeon. And the patient's name was Mr. A. Zapruder. So I operated on Mr. Zapruder, as well as Oswald and Kennedy and Conner. Well, another odd coincidence.
You mentioned the investigation, the second investigation that said that they determined there were multiple shooters but couldn't address it for 50 years. And next year is 50 years from...
Well, no, it'll be 50 years in 2029. 50 years from 1979
From their investigation.
when they reached their conclusion.
They want everybody to be dead that can...
Ma'am?
They want everybody to be dead that can...
That's exactly
say
the
something
thought
is
that
wrong.
I think most of us had, that there were too many people still alive. Now, that brings in, who did set this up? If it wasn't just a crazy guy out, who had a rifle and thought he'd come in and become famous by shooting the president, what was it? Well, there are many, many theories and many, many books written about that. But I've got at least a couple of books that I've acquired recently at Barnes & Noble that have some interesting thoughts that are certainly apocryphal thoughts, but are interesting. And that is that the assassination was probably set up at the highest levels of our government. Maybe from elements of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, maybe under the aegis of General Curtis LeMay, who was the Air Force Chief of Staff General at the time of the shooting, and maybe under the aegis of Hoover and the FBI and their connections with the Mafia. Now, this is all, I emphasize, apocryphal, maybe absolute nonsense. But it's a sort of, there are a couple of books here that have appeared making this, supposition. And they say, well, why did they do that? Well, one of the books says that on at least 3 occasions, they contend, again, apocryphal, they contend, I'm just, telling you what the book said, that they contend that at that time, this was in the hottest point of the Cold War, in the early 60s, late 50s. And there was sort of a question as who was going to bomb who first, Russia or us. General Curtis LeMay at that time, as I said, was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was the head of our Air Force in that way. He's the one who firebombed Tokyo, of course, at the end of the Second World War. And once famously said, we must win the war because if we don't, we're going to be executed by the Japanese as war criminals for what we did to firebombing Tokyo and killing so many people there. Anyway, they also referred to him as Bomber LeMay. So he was a gung-ho, cigar-chewing, no-nonsense sort of general. He wanted to make a nuclear first strike against the Russians before they hit us, according to these books. And on 3 occasions, President Kennedy scotched that. The first was at the Bay of Pigs. The second one was in August of '61 when the Berlin Wall went up. And the third one was during the October 1962 nuclear missile crisis when LeMay really wanted to hit the Russians with a nuclear first strike, and that nuclear crisis period in October of '62. But Kennedy got on the back line with Khrushchev on all three occasions and cooled things off so that there was no possibility of excusing a first strike against the Russians. If you want to believe that or not, I don't know what to believe about that, but maybe all of us are sitting here today because of what President Kennedy may have done to scotch that kind of thing that would maybe killed a great number, not only of the Russians, but us too, with their counterattack. So, yes, ma'am.
I wanted to go back to the bullet wound. She said that the one in the neck was a 22.
Well, we don't know. We said it looked like it was about the size of the 22 that came out the
So,
front.
do you believe that the one in the back of the head was probably a larger caliber?
Oh, yeah, that was a large bullet, and that's the one I think was fired from the picket fence and came in about here and blew out backwards. Had knocked him over backwards into the left. That was a big bullet. The one